must have been no bridge there.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. The recording has started, so we're now being broadcast. And welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to welcome Lynette Kelly from Coventry Council. Lynette, are you permanent or are you just standing in for this one meeting until Coventry have reached a decision?
I'm standing in for this meeting, and this evening we elect the new chair of Scrutiny, so I've no idea who you'll get next.
Well, thank you very much for coming. So, do we have any apologies for absence?
Yeah, we have an apology from Councillor Mike.
Thank you. We are quorate, which is good news. Any declarations of interest on items on the agenda? None. There's only one thing I want to mention in Chairman's remarks, and some of you will remember Amanda Tomlinson, who was Chief Executive of a housing association in the Black Country, who was the business representative. I'd just like, if we could, to record our thanks to her. She did some sterling work. And I think I'm probably right in saying that she had an attendance record better than quite a few councillors, and she didn't get paid. But she played a good role on the task and finish group, which is the subject of an issue on the agenda later on. So if we could record our thanks and send her a note, that would be good. So we have the minutes of the... Sorry.
And if we could place on record as well our thanks to Councillor Akhtar for the work that Councillor Akhtar did as part of this committee, but also certainly when he supported me as vice chair, and the additional work that he did in chairing the task and finish group. So if we can just place that on record as well, please.
Indeed, he was very good on that task and finish group. I think we got somewhere. Minutes of the 1st of July. I don't intend going through page by page. Is everybody comfortable with the minutes, or does anybody have any changes they would like to make? I will take the minutes as a group then. In terms of matters arising, are there any matters arising that councillors would wish to raise or officers might wish to comment on? Everybody's happy. Okay, no matters arising. So we come to the first substantive item on the agenda, which is the annual review letter. Now, my understanding is, look, Linda, are you handling this one for us?
Yeah, I mean, I am. So apologies that I wasn't able to come in person today. I've had an issue at home, but yeah, I am here on behalf of Laura. So if there are any questions around anything for the chief executive, then please, obviously, I will try and help where I can. Yeah, so the annual review, I mean, I'm taking it as read, so I'm just I'm just happy to take any questions if there is anything that you want to raise.
So basically, we've had no complaints, and therefore we're approving or noting a blank sheet of paper, which is nice.
Absolutely.
Which is a nice position to be in.
Yeah.
No questions, councillors? Thank you very much. We'll move on there. The brownfield land remediation task and finish groups recommendations are the next item on the agenda. And I think in the absence of Councillor Akhtar, who has been promoted to a cabinet member in Coventry, I'll perhaps do the introduction on this. We held a series of meetings with business representatives, academics, and other interested parties to try and understand were there any barriers to the combined authorities programme of getting brownfield sites basically into housing where they needed reclamation because they were contaminated in some way or another. And we came up with, it's really 4 recommendations because items 4 and 5 are linked, and those are on pages 11 and pages 12. I don't intend to go through them in detail, but basically they were about most of them were about streamlining the process. just finding little tweaks that you could do to make it a little bit easier. And they're not firm recommendations. On the whole, will you go away and have a look at this? Because it seems to us that you might be able to do something. And here's some guidance on what you might be able to do. There is one that involves a suggestion that the format for brownfield registers is harmonised across the West Midlands. That is not within the gift of the combined authority, but the combined authority may be able to facilitate it. And the purpose of that is we don't have builders that only work in one constituent authority. And if it was made comparable, so they actually knew what they were looking at across the piece, it might just ease it up a little bit, particularly for smaller developers who don't have large staff departments looking at this stuff. Does anybody have any questions on the 4/5 recommendations? Councillor Bainton.
No questions, Chair, but I just want, I have to say it's one of the most challenging task and finish groups I think we've ever done at the combined authority to get to the point we've got to. So I think it's been a good piece of work from both committee members and from officers in getting us to this point. But I just want to pay particular attention and thanks for the inclusion of the biodiversity recommendations, which I personally was particularly keen that we were able to get into this. And it's no attempt to take anything away at all from how a local authority might manage things, but where the combined authority has a responsibility in terms of funding. I'm really pleased to see that this has been included in the recommendations, Chair.
Thank you. It was interesting on that biodiversity issue. One of the challenges that sometimes exists is if a brownfield site has been brownfield for many years, it becomes an ecological gem on occasions and actually has more biodiversity than, shall we say, fields which are fairly large and are pasture and chewed to the ground by sheep, where you don't get a lot of biodiversity. And the view was, and I think it is a very strong view of each of the members of the Task and Finish group, that we do not want offset in East Anglia for the loss of biodiversity in the West Midlands, which under the law is allowed. But if we are funding it as a combined authority, then we want that biodiversity as close to the site as possible, and ideally on the site.
Absolutely, thank you.
Any thoughts? Everybody comfortable? Please go ahead.
Right, it's just a thought that Councillor Akhtar has, that he, as of tomorrow afternoon, will be Cabinet Member for Housing and will have responsibility for planning on Coventry Council. So it might be worth having a word with him about carrying on this work at a political level across the West Midlands to try and find a way of getting that work together, because he was so deeply involved in this. He understands the issue and should be able to run with it.
I'm sure he will. I mean, basically, it's up to the officers to drive it forward. But political support from one of the Task and Finish group members in his new role will be, I'm sure, desirable for the officers. Linda, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just on behalf of the executive board, so just to say thank you very much for the work that the Task and Finish group have done on this. As officers, we will obviously take away the recommendations, look to work with local authority colleagues where appropriate to try and facilitate some of these recommendations. And certainly we're already taking steps following the departure of the previous Director for Housing. We have streamlined the pipeline process into how do we get applications through, and the housing team are working with the single assurance team to simplify and make as efficient as possible the process in terms of application. So as officers, just to reassure, really, we'll take the recommendations and we'll come back to you in due course with whether we've managed to implement or whether we've come across any barriers and how we might have to unhook those.
Thank you. Just before I go then to what we're asked to approve, which is in the first line of this, I'd like to thank Ben Coleman for being open. He was not defensive at all during the whole process and very open to suggestions, and I think that's a credit to him. And Ben, thank you. So we are asked to comment on, which we've done, and then endorse the conclusions and recommendations of the Task and Finish Group for submission and consideration by the board on the 11th of October. Are councillors content with that motion? That's unanimous, is it? Yeah. Thank you. We move on to the next issue, which is down to Peter. Where's Peter? Oh, there, Peter. Sorry. Yes. My understanding is the next two issues are linked. Is that right? Yeah. Is it worth us going through the presentation on both and then doing the discussion, or would you prefer to do it separately?
Both is fine. Yeah.
You do both, because I think they do seem very linked to me when I read them. Thank you. You're on.
Thank you. So yeah, we've got two papers being brought today. One is, the first paper is considering the progress made on the One Public Estate programme, and the second one is the Place Pilots programme, which is a spin-off really of One Public Estates. The chair is correct in that these two items are linked, and they work very closely together. I'm supported today by Chris on the screen, who is the implementation manager for One Public Estate, and Ruby, who is very close to the Place Pilots programme. So if I start off with the One Public Estate, because that's kind of the overarching umbrella. So this is a national programme led by the Cabinet Office, funded by MHCLG, and is delivered in partnership with the Local Government Association. And really it's using funds to deliver place-based programmes of work in the various OP areas. So for our area, the One Public Estate area covers the whole of the West Midlands Combined Authority area. So the programme itself runs until 2029, and we have successfully secured just over £1 million worth of funding. Whilst it's been in our stewardship, previously to our stewardship, it was with the City Council, and they leveraged in just under £1 million worth of funding. The Brownfield Land Release Fund is also another part of the One Public Estate programme, and that provides capital grant funding for kind of small property projects to combat barriers, so things like remediation work. So in terms of a progress update, on page 19 of the pack, actually it's just on page 20, there are some examples here of where the One Public Estate programme itself has laid the foundations and has allowed our local authority members to draw in other sources of funding. So, for example, we've got the West Bromwich Town Centre co-location of public services. OPE was the base for it, and they've secured an additional £25 million of town fund and levelling up funding. Double Depot in Wolverhampton, another 25 million. And Bliston Health and Wellbeing Facility, an additional 20 million. And then on to the appendix, which starts on page 22 of the board pack. So this is the kind of update on the 5-year review of the One Public Estate programme, and it just sets out what the benefits are, what the number of forecasted benefits are. So, for example, we've got a forecasted benefit of just over 2,000 housing units. Through the OPE programme, we've delivered just over 1,000 units, and that carries on onto page 23. So you can see an example of all of the different projects are carrying on there. And I suppose one of the exemplar programmes are those three at the bottom, the Better Outcomes Health and Social Care Integration. So the OPE programme successfully delivered some new health and wellbeing facilities. We've got Bliston Health and Wellbeing in Wolverhampton, Oxley Health Facility in Wolverhampton, and Kingshurst Health Hub in Hollyhole. So those are all committed. I think it's safe to say that we are well recognised within the West Midlands by both Cabinet Office and HCLG and the Local Government Association for running one of the better run programmes in the country. So it's good to have that national success. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I haven't got anything else to add, Peter. Thank you.
So yeah, linked into this is the next paper, which is the PACE Pilots programme. So this is, again, a national programme being delivered through the OP lens from Cabinet Office, and we've been allocated a revenue grant of £500,000 from Cabinet Office. And these it's a pilot programme, so it's designed to look at how we can work a little bit differently in some of our kind of place-based approaches. West Midlands is the biggest pilot within the country. Most other pilots are on a much smaller scale. So for example, we've got a Derby place pilot, which is just looking at Derby, and within London, there's North East London, so it's looking at a very specific part of that area again. So this place pilots programme is the only one that is covering the entirety of a regional area. So we are unique in that place. The PACE Pilots programme was 12 months. That's now been extended until March 2025. And we've got a number of projects that are ongoing at the moment, and those are listed on page 27 of the packs. So we're working with Wolverhampton to look at a shared asset strategy. And that, excuse me, really looking at Wolverhampton as a place, and actually how all of the different public sector bodies within Wolverhampton can have one overarching shared asset strategy rather than each partner having their individual asset strategy. So rather than Wolverhampton City having one, rather than the ICB having one, rather than Fire and Rescue having one, everybody will pull together to have one shared asset strategy. We've got another programme, sorry, I should say on that one as well, that's got quite a lot of attention from the Chief Property Officer at OGP. So he's very invested in this one. And we've got a number of other programmes on the go there, including one which is quite WMCA based. So we're going to be working with Transport for West Midlands to look at the commercial delivery opportunities on things like park and ride sites and our strategic assets, so bus stations and things like that, to look at different collaborative opportunities arriving from those properties. And then even something as simple as having a microsite. So, you know, just having something that allows the partners to share information. There isn't that anywhere else in the country at the moment, which is quite remarkable, really. So actually developing a microsite that looks at how we can collaborate better across the region when we're looking at things like requests for space and, you know, partners for platform to book space and share specialist property related resources. And we are looking at, so this programme finishes in March 2025. So we're just looking at, you know, what that might look like when it comes to an end. What's the legacy from that? We don't know at the moment whether Cabinet Office are going to be releasing any more funding under the PACE pilots, given the nature that it is just a pilot programme. We could see within the next couple of months what that starts to look like. Ruby, did you want to add anything? No? Brilliant, thank you. I babbled on quite a lot there, so yeah, happy to take questions.
Councillors, questions?
Yeah, on the progress chart. So if you go back to the first item, which is running until 2029, you notice that for the vast majority of those markers there, the combined authority is roughly at, if not just below, at least the 50% mark, except for in land released and in cost reductions, where the combined authority is just about a quarter, if not a fifth. And so I just wondered if there was any reason why there was a hold up there and they hadn't reached, bearing in mind this is halfway through and everything else seems to have hit a halfway marker, why they hadn't quite kept up.
Thank you. Yeah, Chris, did you want to come in on that, because you're closer to the detail than I am on those items?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Councillor. So the reason is because we're still working through the detail, particularly around the efficiency savings. So, you know, when local authorities dispose of their assets, there's an exercise to kind of work back what they've actually been spending to sort of maintain that asset. So there's a lot of engagement with the local authority finance colleagues just to make sure that the data that goes back to the Cabinet Office and LGA is the right data, because obviously the OP program is audited. So that's why. Yeah.
Councillor Bates, and then it's after that it's Councillor McCullough.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I always caveat these kinds of discussions with, you can only sell an asset once. And if you're selling a public asset, you have to be really mindful that that money goes back to serving the public, because once it's gone, it's gone. I've got a question really around process. So when I look at the sites that have been sold on page 22, 23, and when I look at the local authorities that have had projects supported, it certainly doesn't cover the entire region. So, you know, we've got 7 Mets, and 7 Mets are not represented in this table. How does the bidding is it a bidding process? How does the application process work for sites, you know, for sales, and then for projects to come forward for support? How does that work, please?
Yeah, so on the One Public Estate programme, that was set at the beginning of the project back in 2019. I wasn't actually here at the time, so I'm not too familiar with the detail on that one, but my understanding is that you know, we went out to all of the partners back in 2019 and asked for expressions of interest. Is that right, Chris?
That's correct. And it is a bidding process, of which obviously funding is not guaranteed. So there is a criteria that has to be met, and obviously we go through a robust evaluation. So that's there is an instance where, you know, some partners are not successful, but also some partners might not actually bid into a certain phase. So yeah, that's fine.
And if I look again at the table, so capital receipts from Sandwell, from Birmingham, from Wolverhampton. I mean, I presume those capital receipts then can be spread across the entire region rather than it just being for a local authority. So if a capital receipt has been received for Wolverhampton, it is, you know, it can be then spread across the whole of the authority region. Is that correct?
So the capital receipts go back to reverse fund either service provision within the local authority, or to reverse fund the delivery of an OPE project. So they're not actually spread across the region.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a pointed supplementary to Councillor Baton's question. I noticed Wolverhampton are very successful. Sandwell are very successful. I noticed that my local authority got one in Kingshurst, but we are probably the least deserving of the authorities. But I noticed that Walsall and Dudley, are there lessons that those authorities could learn? And Coventry, you're right. Are there lessons that they can learn from Wolverhampton and the other success, Sandwell in particular? And have we looked at that to try and help them get some money out of this programme?
Yes, so we do have feedback sessions on a regular basis whenever we bid for funding. So where partners haven't been successful, you know, the Cabinet Office, LGA have feedback sessions to advise and support partners where they haven't been successful. And obviously this is in, you know, ahead of any sort of future bidding rounds. We do have regular formative sessions prior to submission of funding bids. Again, this is to make sure that they are successful, but obviously a lot of the funding that comes through OPE, obviously it's a national kind of fund. So there's a lot of local authorities bidding into the fund. So as I said, it's not guaranteed. And also, we do have, again, peer-to-peer sessions with partners. We do have opportunities where partners that have been successful with their projects can showcase and, again, share lessons with other partners. So yes, so that work is going ahead. Thank you.
If I can suggest that the councillors from, it was Coventry, Walsall and Dudley, go back and ask some questions in their local authorities. I think that just to check that those feedback has actually occurred and that you are indeed actually applying.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you for your answers on that. I think it was Councillor McKay next.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just on page 27, where we talk about the strategic property planning for public transport services. I was just wondering what that sort of looks like, because it talks about to identify commercial and public service delivery opportunities. But I would have thought that'd be endless, wouldn't it? I mean, I wouldn't have thought that we'd really maxed all that out. So I was wondering what, in terms of this document, what we can expect to come from that, or what is coming from that.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're currently at procurement to get some strategic advice on some of that. But there are going to be ample opportunities, I think, when it comes to the TFWM stock. So how we can kind of leverage in and look at our park sites, our bus stations and whatnot, and making sure that actually they're not just hubs that are for transport, but actually they can be areas that people come to, a bit more of a destination. So can we get things like cafes or concessions into those areas? There might be opportunities for some of our sites for solar panel or energy generation. So really it's just taking a strategic broad overview of all of our sites within the TFWM portfolio and looking at what else we can do on top of everything that we're currently doing, and really kind of squeezing and challenging those assets to make the best use of them.
Yeah, because I mean, it's difficult you don't want to sort of push everything with the same stroke, but some of them certainly could do with some TLC, and you want them to be more inviting places, because the more inviting they are, more people will be inclined to travel there, and then obviously use the public transport, etc. So yeah, I wish every luck with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Diane Donaldson, Birmingham City Council. Councillor McKay has asked most of the question that I was going to ask, but I'd just like to add, are there any sites that have been identified in Birmingham for Park and Ride?
That's probably slightly outside the remit of this paper. So this is looking at the existing sites rather than identifying new sites at the moment. But we will be working through, my other hat on, working very closely with transport to look at strategic acquisitions in the future for uses as well.
Thank you.
As a Birmingham representatives can ask that same question at the Transport Committee, and I think it might be a good idea if you did. Any other questions? Councillor Waters.
Thank you. Now, transport isn't this remit, but are there any going forward lessons learned that are actually took forward into the paper to see what was done wrong and what was done right, what could actually be improved and what more of can actually be done? You get me?
Yeah, so I think one thing to take away then is actually doing a lessons learned, particularly with the phase pilots, because we'll be coming to the end of that program in a few months' time. So we can have a look back and do a lessons learned and share that with the constituent members and partners as well. And I think that links very nicely into the question we had earlier about how some authorities are better at securing funding than others. So we can certainly do a lesson shared with everybody.
Councillor Bainton.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the pilot paper, page 27, will you point to the delivery locality infrastructure strategies in partnership, bit of a mouthful, which is really around NHS work. I mean, I know going back to when we did the the deeper devolution deal work, we were very keen, or we were very concerned, we were worried about the work that was proposed with NHS. We'd said at the time that we felt that the combined authority really needed to focus on its core objectives. So I'd be interested to know a little bit more about that. So what exactly is it? What exactly is that pilot work going to deliver?
If I defer to Brian on screen, so Brian Thompson, who is our external place pilots program manager. So Brian has been working up all of these proposals with our partners, so he'll have the detail on that one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, the ICB project is aimed at looking at the integration of health and social care in particular, but then also looking at what other potentially voluntary sector organisations can also come together to create a local infrastructure plan. Just as a bit of context, the ICB in question here has recently developed a long-term infrastructure strategy. What we are doing is taking that strategy and applying it to a locality, is the term that the ICB uses. There are 6 localities within the ICB area. Sorry for all the jargon, but we are focusing on one of those localities and looking at how the relevant public sector partners, so it will be health sector, it will be the social care activities, it will be appropriate voluntary services organisations, can come together to collaborate on assets to deliver the overarching infrastructure strategy. So I hope that provides a little bit more detail about what the jargon actually means in practice.
So in this particular pilot area then, is the CA acting as a facilitator? And would this work not happen if we were not acting as that facilitator? Is there no other mechanism externally by which the ICB and NHS could deliver this themselves, I suppose is where I'm going.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the honest answer is it probably would happen, but not at the same pace and not with the incentive that we will have, picking up the point about lessons learned that was mentioned earlier, the incentive that we will have to ensure that there is a rollout across all the other localities within the ICB area, but also to ICB areas across the region generally. So what we are going to do, and where there probably isn't the incentive within the Birmingham and Solihull ICB, is to draw on the lessons from developing this specific plan and then enable and support the further rollout of this particular piece of work across the entirety of the region. So I think we're doing two things, where we're making it happen sooner and quicker than it otherwise would have happened, but we're also going to do what we can to roll out the concept again as quickly as possible across the region.
Thank you.
Can I just follow that, because it struck me from the first set of questions on the last paper, and we were talking about kind of, I won't say winners and losers, I'll say faster action from some authorities and not quite the same at the same pace from others. Am I seeing a kind of a two-tier approach being delivered in relation to this? Because the issue sounded like it to me that there was some local authorities were more active than others in an area that's obviously a key game-changing blueprint, it says here. But is that game-changing blueprint only be with the authorities that are at the present moment doing some activity in this particular area? Leading in this particular area, I should say.
Yeah, I'll come in and try and answer that as best I can. So I think with the place pilots in particular, the funding that we've got is very, very limited. It's £500,000, and just going back to the fact that these are pilots. So the idea is that we'll have partners that are very, very kind of keen to come forward, develop those pilots. If they're successful, then actually those pilots can then be rolled out across the region. And actually, there's nothing to say that they can't be rolled out nationally if they work. So we're looking at, we're fairly limited in what we can do with that money. So we can't apply it right across to all of the partners at the moment. It's, pilots in very particular areas, but I think, that the health one in particular, if that works well, actually there's lessons to be learned from that. How can that be applied if that were to be rolled out regionally and nationally then? That makes sense.
Chair, I think it just opens more questions than the answers given, if you don't mind me saying. And I see that I recognise it's a small sum of money, isn't it? But the issue is still there, isn't it? If we're sitting around the table as a combined authority looking to deliver innovation and to take our authorities forward in a way that we haven't done previously, I'm no good at this diplomacy, like I would just say what's in. Are we creating the two-tier systems where maybe some of our local authorities keep being repeated as we go through this process, with some winners and some losers? And if it is that way we're moving, then what's the strategy to make sure that it's a more even race?
Peter, I think Chris has got his hands up. It's on this issue, is it, Chris?
Thanks, Councillor. It is, and just to reflect on some of the comment that has been made around sort of the funding. So for the OP programme, there's an element. So the funding is constrained. So as an example, the last OPU round, we had £1 million nationally, and you got 20 something like 54 local authorities in the country bidding for £1 million. So whilst there is work done with local authority partners ahead of any funding launches around what projects they want to sort of put forward, a lot of those projects will be costed by the partners. So if the funding pot is £1 million, I think there's a slight kind of de-incentive, which almost puts our local authority partners off. And thus almost plays into that kind of what to borrow your words, what appears like a two-tier system, but actually there isn't, because approaches and engagement is local authority, West Mid, the region-wide engagement. But because of the funding that comes through, it kind of creates that kind of challenge to sort of encourage partners to bid and take their bids forward. Thank you.
Peter, did you wish to add anything?
only to say really that again, I think it's a valid point in terms of lessons learned, and actually it's particularly with the place pilots, it's looking at the legacy and how we can take some of these projects that we're doing going forward and actually applying them right across the region. So, being a bit more joined up and clever in our thinking around, the work that's going on in Ed Cox's team, and then those kind of locality-based strategies as well. So I totally get your points, and I think, there's a lesson learned here to be how we can, fairly apply some of the projects that are coming out from these programs right across the region, so that we don't create that two-tier approach. Hopefully, that gives a bit of reassurance.
Just before I bring in Councillor Fenter, I just want to check my understanding. If we take that issue about the NHS and the ICBs, I don't know how many ICBs we've got in the West Midlands, but it's clearly more than one. So the idea is that you run a pilot in this particular one, which happens to include my borough, but it'll be dominated by Birmingham because it always is in that ICB. You will learn some lessons, and then they will be those lessons will be spread out by the combined authorities into the other ICBs. That's the thought process that's going on, is it?
Yeah, so we have various forums that are set up for sharing lessons learned, as we said previously. But I would say as well, we're enablers in this, so it's also down to, ICB should be working closely with the other ICBs in the area and sharing those lessons learned as well. It's not simply down to the combined authority to be doing all the doing on this. We're very much in an enabling role to enable, the local authorities, the ICB, the blue light services, to actually come together and start thinking a bit more strategically about some of this stuff, and actually applying those lessons learned and what's gone well and what hasn't gone well with, the other partners within the region as well. So that's what I have to say on that.
Councillor Bateman, does that answer it?
I think the answer that's come out for me, which is rather clear, is the sum of money is so small that it's past its wafer thin. Local authorities will be under individually their own pressures and their own issues, and then within that there'll be their own priorities. I do think there's likelihood of a two-tier split here, because resources within each of the local authorities are different, and the pressures on each of the local authorities, as we see and read, like MJ and LGA and all that stuff, are large and pressing. I think small schemes like this, it's inevitable some of the members will be at a different speed than others going forward, especially if they don't feel that they're going to get a share of a very small piece of pie, and their priorities will go elsewhere. I think the lessons learned are really important, because if we're going to be involved in something like this, there's a lesson for government. Don't make the scheme so darn small that it becomes worthless or difficult to deliver across a conurbation like the size of the West Midlands. And because people will think in other directions, I'm quite sure. I do think it's going two-tier as it stands at the moment. Maybe things will change with government thinking differently as we go forward. But I think the lessons learned for us is keep an eye on it, because we all want to see West Midlands delivered at a fair and fairly good pace.
Councillor Fenter.
Thank you, Chair. It's the funding that I want to come in on for clarification, because I do wonder, and I know that during my time here 3 years ago with the levelling up funding, that two-tier system where local authorities go away and enter a competition to see whether they are successful or not at drawing down the town funding and the levelling up funding, is what was going to be done away with, in part with the Trailblazer deal. So I just wondered, given the questions that we're asking on colleagues, particularly with the two-tier, didn't the levelling up, didn't the Trailblazer agenda deal with that levelling up problem that took away that two-tier system? So we can expect to see it being very different in the future, and that fairness put in place?
Kate has indicated she wishes to answer.
Ultimately, yes, and that's what we're working to. Not necessarily every fund will be immediately into single settlement, so we are still working with government about what is in scope and out of scope, but obviously the ultimate direction of travel is for everything to be in there. Certainly as they kind of continue to evolve or continue, one of the things is we don't know what funds will continue in the next spending review as well, but yes, it's not.
So just to finish my thought, because this is when I read this report, what I'd come away with is that this pilot scheme works perfectly with that sort of funding stream, where thereby you'd be able to share those lessons learned with the pilots across the whole of the authority, combined authority, and then the other aspect of this would be that the powers from that trailblazer deal would mean that the whole of the combined authority would have an equal share at being able to put in place anything that sort of comes from this pilot. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's well summarised.
Councillor Keppel, if you could switch your microphone on.
No, it's all right.
Oh, okay. So,
Chair, sorry.
Penny Taylor.
Just on the equality bit, so the purpose of single standard, so the ether and the combined authority, what we've always operated on is money goes to where there is need, rather than necessarily everybody gets the same amount of money at the same time. So any fund that kind of a single settlement will continue to operate on that principle. So we will have place-based strategies that will come for LAs, and it will be on need rather than, you know, a kind of divide by 7 on a formula basis and take money out.
Apologies, I should have used the word equitable.
Equitable, yeah, sorry, yeah, equal, yeah.
I think we're about there. I did at the beginning say my local authority was probably not first in the list for this, and it shouldn't be, because of this. The projects go where the need is, and I read somewhere it is actually in the terms of reference, isn't it? It talks about on one of these the more disadvantaged. I actually read that somewhere, hence my comments about. So I hope we are actually pursuing that agenda. Obviously, within my borough, there are certain things like in Kingshurst is in there, and Kingshurst is one of the most deprived areas of my borough, and I do aware that. But certain other boroughs are significantly more deprived than my borough. But you can reassure us that even if the pilot is in something that's called Birmingham and Solihull, all the lessons learned from that project will be equally shared amongst all the other constituent authorities.
Absolutely, that's the plan, yeah.
So we might learn things in a richer area, because Birmingham is actually better off, I think, on average than Dudley and Sandwell. I can't remember Wolverhampton's stack in this, but I'm sorry. But whatever happens, it will be spread out across the region. That is what your purpose is to do.
In terms of the lessons learned, yeah. And I think just to kind of add to that as well, don't forget that the Place Pilots programme is a national programme. So actually there'll be lessons that we can learn from pilots that have happened elsewhere in the country that may be appropriate to the West Midlands as well, that we haven't tried out here. So yeah, I think there'll be some national learning that comes out of this also.
Councillors, are there any other comments? What are we asked to do? Note the 2 reports.
The comments and consider the current progress, and we have that recommendation rising on the Place Pilots programme, the lessons learned.
Indeed, we do. And obviously, the key question is, if you're going to produce a lessons learned report, when? Give us a date so we can put it in the programme. Are we talking 6 months' time, 3 months' time, 24 years' time?
I think probably the most appropriate time will be March 2025, because that's when the programme comes to an end, and at that point all of the monies will have been committed. So these projects, the projects themselves might have not been fully completed, but they will have all been committed, and there'll be significant progress made on most of them. So I think March March 25, April 25 is probably the most appropriate time. But I will look to colleagues to see if they have a different view to me on that.
Peter, no, I think you're absolutely right, and this aligns to the scope of service or the specification for the consultants who will be appointed to take forward every project that's mentioned on page 27. They will have to wrap up their piece of work with a discrete lessons learned think piece, which we will then consolidate into a region-wide lessons learned think piece, and there needs to then be a strategy about how that is shared and communicated. But yes, it's going to be at the end of this financial year.
Councillors content with that? So we're going for March?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, colleagues, for, I think I found that interesting, and the chat made the dryness of the report a little better, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're now moving on to the energy strategy. And you have a presentation on screen, I believe, is that right? Thank you. So this is Laurie Duncan.
Hi.
I stand up? Should I just?
Probably better if you sit down. The mics aren't great if you're away from them.
See that? Okay. I can race through this, or I can go through it in incredibly dry detail. How long would you like me to present for?
25 minutes should be fine, yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. So, yes, thank you for having me, Chair. It's a pleasure to present. We've been going through a very extensive consultation process throughout the refresh of this regional energy strategy, and we wanted to include the committee as part of that process. As a refresher, we have a regional energy strategy for the West Midlands. It was adopted at the start of 2019. This was before Energy Capital, which the team that I work in was part of the combined authority. It was established as an external partnership formed of local authorities put some money in, university put some money in, and it was based on innovation projects. I think that's one of the things the original energy strategy was focusing on. So it was talking about carbon budgets, but this was the days before net zero. This was still an 80% reduction in carbon emissions rather than 100%. It was about industrial energy costs, which are obviously still relevant, if not more relevant today. Reducing fuel poverty in the region, which is one of the major areas that we still focus on, our retrofit programs. And it was about establishing energy innovation zones, which were one articulation of a place-based approach to energy sector innovation. As I say, there have been some changes. A really significant one is the climate emergency declarations that local authorities have made, including the combined authorities target of the 2041 net zero date. That is a very disproportionate impact on this strategy because the West Midlands has a very industrial base, and an awful lot of the remaining 20% of emissions that existed in those previous targets was reserved for those difficult to decarbonise sectors, including industries. And so that is now has to be decarbonised. We don't really have a choice there. And so that is going to be a difficult aspect of this. In a more positive way, we have devolution now in a much greater way than was the case at the time of the last strategy's production. We also have other national regulatory changes in the form of the Regional Energy System Planner. So that is a new body that Ofgem, the energy regulator, is setting up to produce more local, well, regional, but more spatially small strategic plans for the whole energy system. So rather than, as is currently the case, the electricity system and the gas system and heat networks all being planned separately in their silos, they are going to start to move towards a more whole systems approach, which is very good for place-based opportunities to be identified. We also now have a very good track record as a region of working together on innovation projects. There's a list of them there. I won't scatter acronyms throughout the conversation because there are plenty of them, but we have a good track record of programs of delivering innovation projects, as well as delivery of retrofit through our consortium across the region. As I say, we've had a lot of input consultation as part of this refresh process to reflect these changes. Kicked it off at our last conference last September. We have monthly collaboration days where we invite partners from across the energy sector, across the region as well, to discuss strategic themes that have come up, so transport in energy, digitalisation in energy, these sort of things. We have consulted with our universities. Specifically, we have had one-to-one meetings with local authorities at director level, as well as ongoing meetings that we have at local authority level for our various programs. We've had drop-in meetings, we've had a forum on our website, we've had internal policy groups within the combined authority, and we also have our technical advisory board for energy capital. These maps essentially tell the story of the West Midlands energy system. It used to be that energy was produced where it was required. That is no longer the case. So as 2023, the West Midlands, this is a wider region, but it stands for the metropolitan region as well. There's a great big gap in the middle where the West Midlands is. All of the generation that we now have, large generation certainly, is offshore wind, as well as gas stations, power stations, things like that. They are all much further away from where this large demand centre in the West Midlands is now. And that does present a significant challenge for the electricity system in particular. But as we decarbonise and move to generally greater electrification, it applies to the energy system as a whole. And this is really what's driving it. It used to be coal power stations, and they no longer exist in the West Midlands. We have within the metropolitan region a single bioenergy plant above. It's the threshold for this particular map, but the point stands for small scale generation as well. We don't generate very much electricity in this region. And in fact, all sorts of projections and assessments have suggested we're never going to be able to generate enough to meet our own demand, particularly in winter peak, for instance. Generation from things like solar and wind are at their lowest, but demand is highest for heating. So we are always likely or going to be importing energy from other regions. For some regions, Scotland, for instance, is likely to always be exporting electricity with its enormous wind resource, just because of the space constraints, the density of energy demand within the West Midlands. That's never going to be the case here, and so we need a different approach to that. As well as that, the potential for plug and play, as we describe it, renewables installations, so that is putting a big solar farm in a greenfield. There are relatively few opportunities for that in the West Midlands, and given land constraints, it's not necessarily the best strategic use of that land. And so that's not a solution here in the way that it might be in other parts of the country. We do have good transmission grid connections, so that does make it easier for us to import electricity from further away in the country, so importing electricity from Scotland or the southwest, for instance. We have good electricity connections for that. At distribution level, which is the more local grid, the one that you see small substations attached to, there are more constraints there, and that is something that we will need to address. One final point, though, about density of demand we have, it does mean that an awful lot of the West Midlands is very suitable for transitioning to heat networks. So there are many generations of heat networks, but modern heat networks are typically electrically powered rather than gas or CHP powered. The density of demand within the West Midlands means that they can be rolled out very widely and affordably. Crucially, we don't want to be punishing communities with a heat network if it's incredibly expensive. That wouldn't be the case in the West Midlands. I'll just rush through these briefly. So essentially, I think it's well established now that there are excellent opportunities to be had with addressing climate change in a place-based way. The case for that, an Innovate UK report that came out a couple of years ago, suggesting that you get 6 times the benefit if you approach net zero in a place-specific way as opposed to a place-agnostic way. That's absolutely at the centre of how we want to approach this in a regional strategy. We want this to be a regional economic opportunity as well. So where the Northeast has its USP of offshore wind, that's clearly not going to be the case in the West Midlands. Similarly for the Northwest, they are very pioneering in hydrogen and carbon capture and storage technologies. Geographically, those aren't necessarily going to be a good fit for the West Midlands, but there is an opportunity here to identify a regional USP based on the constraints and the opportunities that I've set out. That will allow us then to pursue that as a strategic goal. And the thing that we have identified, given all of these constraints, is smart energy systems. So this is the ability for the energy system to be more flexible and to be able to shift demand and generation in ways that mean that we can essentially do more with less. There is a government plan for this. The government, through regulator Ofgem, produced the Smart Energy and Flexibility Plan in 2021, setting out what is required to make the energy system more smart. We want to be the region that pioneers this and really drives this through, creating opportunities for the West Midlands, as well as exporting that to the country more widely. And then finally, on the just transition point, it's very important that communities aren't left behind in this. We want to make sure that the value is generated through this transition is retained locally, not benefiting others while people don't retain that here. That's one of the crucial aspects that we want to be holding on to. So this is the vision that we want to set out by 2041, which is our net zero target date. The West Midlands will have trailblazed the route to a smarter UK energy system, creating prosperity for the region and enabling a fairer net zero transition for our communities. It's a big picture, but essentially it's saying smart energy systems are the thing that we want to pioneer in the future. I will go through each of these pillars in very brief detail because I think it would be more interesting to have some time for questions, but we have these 5 strategic pillars that we've set out as the areas that we think the West Midlands will need to focus on in order to achieve this vision, as well as the policy foundation, which is our list of asks to government. That's more specifically from the combined authority, although within each of these pillars there is a large recognition that this needs to be delivered far beyond the combined authority. This needs to be through local authorities, through private companies, through universities. This needs a very broad approach. So on smart spatial planning, this is essentially about saying the alignment of different planning processes will make it much easier for an energy system to be made smartly. This is about not only electricity and gas and heat all being planned in the same way, it's also about making sure that those planning processes talk to spatial planning and transport planning in the same way, and making sure that that is facilitated with data that is available within the energy system but isn't currently shared in optimal ways. So we have good examples of how this has been done with UK Central. Previously, the grid had not been taking into account an expected increase in electricity demand for the UK Central development. There was a very intensive engagement process. They then recognised that in their following year's projections. That's a good example of how it can be influenced, but that's too resource intensive. We have a local area energy planning tool that is being developed, and that's one way that we can go about digitalising that process, making that much easier to make sure that different planning, different people in planning silos are able to talk to each other much more easily. The second one is on local flexibility. So this is really making sure that we are looking at the whole range of solutions for local grid constraints, where people maybe aren't able to get an EV charger installed in their home. There might be a problem with their local substation. There are ways that we can deal with this that aren't simply upgrading the grid to have bigger wires, essentially. We can do this using battery technologies, other flexibility and storage technologies. We can do this with demand side response, which is where technologies can be turned down so the demand is reduced at peak times in ways that don't impact the users. There is a huge opportunity here for this market to grow. Currently, there is a market for national scale storage within the energy market, but there isn't the equivalent at a local level. And so as a result, at the moment, if we implemented all of this, none of that value that we would create with these local assets, these storage assets would be retained locally. And we want to make sure that that changes, because that's not a satisfactory solution either. And one way that that can be done is using heat networks as a storage solution in themselves. So we can essentially charge up a heat network when there is excess electricity available from renewables. That heat is then, or that energy is stored as heat in the network rather than having to store it as electricity. There are a range of technological solutions to this. The next one is on renewables. So this is recognizing that as part of our climate commitments, we are going to need more renewable energy generation within the region, but it's about making sure that we're doing that in a smart way. So it's making sure that we are not putting renewables, large renewables, in places where there is no electricity demand, which would have an adverse impact on the electricity distribution network. Making sure that as part of those planning processes mentioned in Pillar 1, we are looking at opportunities where we put solar panels on roofs rather than in fields, looking at making sure that it is paired with large demand sites, it's particularly around industrial sites, but also looking at storage technologies as well. There are good examples of where solar farms have been put up next to battery storage, and that significantly lessens the impact on the grid and makes it a lot easier to deliver back. Fourth one is on skilled workforce and supply chain. So it has two parts. It's recognizing that we have a lot of expertise on smart energy systems already within the West Midlands, and that is a huge asset as the energy transition progresses. And we want to make sure that we're not losing out to the fact that there are lots of opportunities for offshore wind and so on. We want to make sure that we are helping to meet the national skills shortage for all of these sort of smart energy systems jobs. They are well-paid jobs, they are highly skilled jobs. We want to make sure that the right people are in the right roles for this transition, and we can play a role as the West Midlands in that. And then secondly, it's about making sure that supply chains that are produced for delivery of lots of these technological solutions are recognised within the single settlement aspect and the devolution deal more widely. This is a great opportunity for us to work with skills colleagues to make sure that training opportunities for things like retrofit of domestic properties are paired with funding opportunities for that retrofit. So we move away from the boom and bust funding that we've seen so many times in the retrofit industry, where there's an awful lot of money made available for 6 months or a year. It doesn't lead to a sustainable growth in demand for that, and it also doesn't lead to an awful lot of retrofit being done. So it's about recognising the opportunities we have with devolution to look at that in a more holistic way and grow it more sustainably. And then finally, we have commercial and financial innovation. So we have great track record of innovation within the region in the energy system, but crucially, this is no longer really about technological innovation. Of course, that will continue, but the key innovation that we need now is how do we package up existing solutions for the energy transition in ways that are financeable, in ways that are of interest to businesses, and in ways that benefit local businesses as well. And so this very much links in with the supply chain point in Pillar 4. and how we can make sure that that supply chain grows. So this is where the innovation is really going to be required. Of course, lots of working with universities within the region, and it's the local net zero accelerator program that Energy Capital currently has is looking at how you develop a regional fund which brings in all sorts of funding sources. So people looking to buy a range of outcomes. That could be carbon reduction, it could be health improvements, public health improvements, air quality improvements, making sure that all of these things can be tied into these broader projects in a holistic way. There's the 5 pillars. And then we have a range of policy asks relating to things like the Smart Energy and Flexibility Plan. We're hoping to arrange a roundtable to make sure that that is still being pursued within the government. Looking at a range of more technical aspects around EPCs, that's energy performance certificates for buildings. Currently, that methodology doesn't necessarily reflect best practice in retrofit. There are other organisations that have made the case for alterations to that that would better, that would make it easier to pursue the energy transition. So I'll stop there. I'll return back to the following slide. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. We're on already. Councillor McKay.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your presentation. Believe it or not, it's probably a long time since I went to school, but so there was the bit that I was quite intrigued on. So you're talking about moving a sort of electricity around the country, and I obviously understood that you have a hydroelectric plant that you stood next to a big waterfall, but you put the factory next to it because it's meant to be very wasteful for electricity to be transported. And I was just interested, have you overcome that, or is it still burning quite a lot of electricity to move it around the country?
It's still very beneficial to ensure that generation is located as close to demand as possible, and that's the case for the co-location of renewables in particular. In many ways, that's also to deal with local grid constraints. So making sure that we're using behind the meter solutions as much as possible. So essentially the grid never really sees the impact of a new solar panel being put on a roof, for instance. But as I mentioned before, the transmission network, which is the one that really sort of does the bulk flows of electricity across the country, that's in a pretty good position. We are well situated within the West Midlands as far as that network goes. So that's not quite so bad.
Yeah, okay.
Councillor Baker.
Thank you. And thanks for the presentation. It was really, really informative. Questions around retrofit. So, I mean, we all acknowledge and we know the absolute benefit of retrofitting our homes for winter and to keep cool in summer. We also know that we have a huge challenge to do that across the housing stock that we have in the West Midlands. Is there any kind of plan as we stand at the moment about how we're going to roll out a retrofit programme? Now, you've alluded to the skills issue where we've had people who've been trained in retrofit, the work hasn't been there for them, then the skills are lost. So I know it's about getting those worked out together, and I understand the skill issue within that, but if we are going to make a significant impact for our residents across the region, then for me, retrofit has to be one of the key policies that we really make sure we know that we're able to deliver on for them in a timely manner.
Thank you. Absolutely. So the devolution deal, the central aspect of that is domestic retrofit. And so my colleague in our team that's specifically working with delivery partners at the moment on how we work to deliver that with a devolved fund, which will be quite transformative. It does mean that it will be much easier to be strategic in the way that we roll out retrofit. So currently there are half a dozen different funding routes for households to look at retrofitting their home.
quite difficult to navigate. It's confusing whether you qualify for one type or the other. We have two separate delivery programs in the combined authority sorting aside from those funding programs as well. And so, yeah, one of the main drivers behind the devolution deal is the ability for us over the next, I think it's about the next 6 months or so, we'll be shaping what does a strategic approach to retrofit look like? Where should we be targeting first? How should we be targeting? I think a lot of that comes down to a place-based approach. So that's being demonstrated through our Net Zero Neighbourhood programme. That's demonstrating that a place-based approach at neighbourhood scale is a good way to go about doing retrofit. It builds a critical mass and makes it much easier to give confidence to supply chains. So that place-based approach where it's less strictly about certain indicators as to who qualifies or who doesn't. That's one way that we will be looking at making sure that's a key part of the devolution funding.
Thank you. And I mean, I'm from Dudley, so our authority took part in the neighbourhood retrofit pilot. And I think it would be really useful, you know, when we've been talking about lessons learned from previous papers, if we could actually see how that pilot has worked, I'm personally aware of some of the difficulties that there have been with that pilot, but it's then about how we learn those lessons so that those pilots we're able to roll them out much more widely and much more successfully for people. And also, what has the benefit been for those neighbourhoods? How quickly do they see that benefit? You know, with prices ever increasing, benefit has to be felt very quickly, I think.
Next Tuesday, the University of Wolverhampton, and one of the panels in the afternoon is lessons learned from the first Net Zero Neighbourhood demonstrator. So you're very welcome to come along with that. That's wonderful. We will have a range of speakers on that, and we'll also be covering throughout the day what smart energy system opportunities look like throughout the region, what are the political opportunities that come up over the last few months, and how might organisations be able to endorse this strategy in a range of different ways. But yeah, Net Zero Neighbourhoods will absolutely be on the agenda.
If you could send me the details of that, perhaps through Lindsay, I'd be really interested in being able to go to that. Thank you.
Councillor Bateman. Sorry, Councillor Kettle, sorry.
Totally threw me there, Chair.
Sorry about that. I'm a bit sceptical about some of the ideas you've got. I'm a believer in self-sufficiency, and I would like to see energy production much nearer to home. We have high ground all around us in the Midlands, which use the wind-based system near Kent, near Gorham, in Dudley. We've also got the new micro nuclear Rolls-Royce issue, where we've got some very small local usage which can be created by very small nuclear power, very similar to what they use in the atomic submarines. And yet you don't mention this. I think this idea is fundamentally deflationary, in that we've always got to pay for the energy first before we get anything. If you do a smelt side of the area, it always means that we've got far less economic activity within the area. And I think your system is fundamentally deflationary. Am I making sense?
I would counter that with the plan for growth, which the Combined Authority developed, I think it was last year, which identifies smart energy systems as a fundamental area for a growth opportunity for the region. So it's certainly not deflationary, and that there are a whole range of opportunities that don't just involve generation. On generation specifically, we've spoken to West Midlands about options for small nuclear within the region. there are all sorts of constraints on siting of nuclear, which do make it pretty much impossible within the metropolitan region. There may be options in the West Midlands region more widely. We have also had very productive conversations with other county councils in the wider region about pursuing a renewable energy scoping study. What the is in place, so we would look to identify a quantitative opportunity for how much solar generation could we have, how much wind generation could we have, and so on, to look at the technologies more individually. So that is something we're certainly interested in pursuing, but the recognition of smart systems here is that within the metropolitan boroughs specifically, there are significant constraints on the electricity grid, which do make it more difficult to and more expensive to simply load on more generation. And actually, there are technological alternatives using flexible demand, using storage technologies that allow you to shift where the peaks are in that system that themselves had economic value. And we want to make sure that we're capturing those so that they're recognised on par with added generation.
But we can use, if I may, Mr. Chairman, we can use battery systems ourselves locally from our own power. We can produce our own power. We've got the food chain where we're this promise of devolution. I'm very skeptical about this because the London pork barrel controls the money, and whether you like it or not, if we start eroding in the pork barrel and the strength of the pork barrel in London, and they find the devolution starts to hurt them, there'll be a reaction against us. And this is politics, whether you like it or not. And I'm very sceptical. I am. You know, we talk about retrofit. The bills have been increased with virtually a poll tax. Green levy is little more than a poll tax on every household. It's working. It's helping people improve their properties. Some people, not everyone. And you know, the concept of retrofit being a success business, I think it's fallacy. It's based on a poll tax, and once again, you're taking money out of the system, and you're applying it through a system to create retrofit. But fundamentally, was it 40% of your bill now is now some form of green levy? The standing charges are ever increasing. It's once again, it's fundamentally deflationary. And when we look at our economy, we've got to be careful about what we're doing. We've got to create wealth, not deny it.
Well, on the levy point, I don't know the exact numbers, but one of the things we would be lobbying for would be a rebalancing of levies, because currently they all sit on electricity bills when the gas bills aren't actually levied at all. And so that rebalancing would make transition make much more economic sense. On your point of local generation for the storage, yeah, that's absolutely what the third pillar is talking about. It's making sure that we use these technologies to enable us to have more local generation, small scale, certainly. It's more the very large scale solar farms that we would struggle to accommodate with current grid constraints, but making as much as we possibly can from rooftop solar on domestic and commercial buildings, those sort of things. Also exploring geothermal opportunities. Obviously, mining in the West Midlands, there are a lot of opportunities for extracting heat from flooded mines. So all of these things we'll certainly be considering and understanding how we can best maximise those economic opportunities, but doing them in a way that recognises fundamental infrastructure constraints that we have at the moment and how we work around those.
You say we've got a good delivery system in the West Midlands. We have problems in Dudley where we've got DY5, which is a enterprise zone in Orwood Lane, and we can't get people in there because we can't get the energy in there. It's so expensive to get the energy in. We've got several big employers who couldn't move into the area because they couldn't get the source of power they wanted. So it can't all be that good in and Rosie in the West Midlands County.
That's exactly the sort of electricity system constraint I'm talking about. So that's where we need to figure out ways that don't involve very expensive upgrades to that grid to enable a connection to a business, to an industry, whatever it might be, which is currently the planning process. So it's everyone can connect essentially for free until they reach a constraint, at which point the next person to connect pays the enormous bill for upgrading the substation to have larger capacity. And that's not a very sensible way, it's not a very strategic way of taking into account large demand. And so this is also about looking at when that's not necessarily the most suitable way of accommodating that extra demand, there may be ways of doing that which use storage, for instance, so that the impact on the grid is not so high that they require a large upgrade. So it's about working with National Grid to make sure that in their planning processes, they can recognise the value of deferred upgrades, for instance.
But you're losing the authority locally, aren't you? You're going back to the national system, which has worked against us in many ways. You haven't mentioned things like Sizewell B and Sizewell, which is a third French owned, half French owned. You know, EDF. You haven't mentioned that kind of enormous power that's going to come on stream sooner or later.
With so National Grid, confusingly, is the name of our local distribution network as well as the national transmission network. So working on connections in particular for individual businesses, that's more with the local distribution network. So that's less impacted by large generation like that. That's more of an issue for the national electricity transmission network. On your point on devolution, separately, absolutely. One of the things that we want to move away from is a reliance on solely public funding for growing this. The problem has been that that's sort of been the only signal that's been sent to the market to grow the retrofit industry, and that's not been a very sustainable way of doing it. It's been very boom and bust, and we can move away from a reliance on solely public funding if we can leverage that funding as part of the devolution deal to create a much broader range of offers for people who are able to pay, for instance, rather than relying on that public subsidy to carry out their retrofit. So if we can leverage that funding that we currently have as part of the devolution pilot, the idea is then we aren't as reliant as we currently are on bidding into individual parts of the funding for retrofit programs. So the idea is to leverage it as much as possible to don't have that reliance on Westminster funding.
Thank you, Laurie. I'd like to move on now. We've got three other councillors who've indicated they'd like to speak in this order: Councillor Kelly, Councillor Fenton, and then Councillor Mackay.
I'll be very brief, Chair. I think it's very important in any meeting, but especially one that's being broadcast publicly, that any assertions made are correct, and if they're incorrect, they're corrected as soon as possible. My colleague here asserted that roughly 40% of electricity bills are made up of the green levy, and I've just quickly Googled it to get some information on that, because that did seem rather disproportionate, and the answer that I've got from the iNews website is it's 8% or 12% if you take into account the social tariffs that are going in there. So I think it is important that we realise that that is not the reason for electricity bills to have gone up so much. It's much more connected to the war in Ukraine and various other factors that are going on outside of our control. The other thing is that it's imperative that we work closely with government to reinforce the message that we need long-term planning on all of these things. What we've had for years and years and years is short-term planning and knee-jerk reactions to things as they occur. And that's why we've had this boom and bust within the different sectors. That's why we've had ideas of, let's do this, let's have this policy that will encourage people to have an LNG certificate when they're selling their house, so you know how leaking the house is when you buy it, and a whole load of people train up in that industry, and then that requirement is slashed and nobody needs to do it anymore. We need long-term planning in order that we can achieve the outcomes for the general public, as well as what we as an authority want to achieve.
Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's in keeping with that really, but they're more questions for you than sort of the statement, because energy generation is going to be key. and small scale energy generation. So I did write down initially about energy creation from waste, but then I saw that you put it on a slide later on, because I think that that's a really key aspect, particularly locally. Also, I think it reduces the carbon footprint. If we're using our combined authorities waste to generate the combined authority energy, we're not travelling that, dumping it in landfill. So I'd really like to hear more about the opportunities for that to come up. If I may, Chair, I'll just go down so that I don't then have a back and forth. So hopefully you remember them all, but if you don't, you can prompt me. The other problem I've got, and it is a bit of a problem, is I don't quite understand the battery technologies. It was my understanding that the shelf life was very small on these and they needed replacing very often. It was also my understanding that that came with a large carbon footprint because we can't recycle them. Now, I'm assuming if you use batteries, and I use you in a very formal, because I know that you won't be going and digging it out yourself and putting the battery in, but if we were to use batteries, I'm assuming they're going to have to be very big. I'm also assuming that that's going to require a lot of minerals that are going to have to be dug out. And so I'm worried about that carbon offset. Are we exporting carbon offset from the West Midlands? And then I'm looking at, sorry, and I do apologise to everyone, it jumps around a bit. Those that have worked with me before will know that that's how my brain works. But that then prompts me into the electric cars and how that's going to work on terraced houses. Electric cars are all very well for people that have got to drive, but if you live in terraced accommodation where you can't park a car outside one house because the cars are longer than the houses are wide, how are we going to come across that problem? And is maybe hydrogen cars something that might be more realistic? And then the last one would be the heat network zoning. I'm just struggling to get my head around how communal heating works. I have asked, I know there's been a number of pilots and I've asked for people to give me some feedback and some information on how that's worked out. Prices in particular, and how that divvies out and how you ensure that you are equitable rather than equal on your price. For example, if you're a 1-bedroom flat that's using a very small proportion of energy to heat your flat compared to a sort of 3-bedroomed house, how does that fit in? And that's I know they jump around a bit, I'm so sorry, but that's just the way my brain works. Thank you.
No problem at all. So on energy from waste, we have said within this strategy that energy from waste resources will be useful in the short to medium term, certainly, particularly as something that, as a large heat source, that can potentially make a heat network more viable to install that infrastructure while there is an existing energy from waste site currently. It may be the case that over the next 10, 20 years, it's likely to be the case that certainly older generation energy from waste sites aren't actually beneficial when it comes to carbon. As grid electricity renewables roll out much more, actually the carbon intensity of a unit of electricity from the grid, drawing on all sorts of local rooftop generation and things like that, as well as larger national assets, it will then make energy from waste assets less favourable in that sense. So, and there are other newer technologies coming along. There are demonstrator plants across the West Midlands. There's one in Wednesbury that we had a collaboration there a few months ago, which is looking at more innovative ways of doing that rather than simply just burning waste. They have more refinery. I can't remember the technical details of it, but they do it in a different way. That it's a less sort of crude approach to just extracting energy from burning it. But yeah, we want to leverage existing infrastructure as much as we possibly can to ease this transition when it comes to heat networks. I'll just jump to heat networks now while I'm on that. So they work in a metered way in the same way that the gas network or the electricity network are. So they can meter usage, and so it can be priced equitably. There are 4 people using electricity versus 1, obviously, heat, I should say. You wouldn't be charged the same for that. So there are ways of metering that, so it is fair. Heat networks have also fairly recently come under the regulation of Ofgem now in the same way the electricity and gas networks are. So they are now all regulated by the same body, which will make that an easier thing to monitor in the future as well. On battery technologies, so there are a whole range of different technologies. So the type that's used in laptops and phones and so on, lithium ion, that's just one technology of dozens and dozens. There are also storage technologies that use that don't use chemical batteries, they use physical energy batteries. So there used to be a demonstrator at the University of Birmingham which used compressed air. So you would charge up the battery by compressing air, and then you would discharge the battery by letting that air out to turn the generator. So there are a whole range of different technologies available. Different technologies are more suitable for different applications. So some will be suitable for very instantaneous response that's needed to balance the grid, to home, for instance. Others are more suitable for longer term duration and just generally larger capacity batteries. So there is a whole range of technologies being used. There are already examples of these technologies being used on the grid in Busselhome, for instance. Yeah, there are a wide range of these. So it's not. It's also not the case that lithium-ion batteries degrade at the same rate they would have done 10, 15 years ago. That there's been significant development in that technology now. So that does tend to be the go-to technology for that small-scale, rapid discharge of electricity. But there is a wide range of technologies, and that will continue to be expanded on. And in fact, there's a lot of research within the West Midlands on that battery industrialisation centre in Coventry. University of Warwick Manufacturing Group have a large area of work on batteries. But yeah, that's on the carbon footprint and minerals. Obviously, yes, when it comes to lithium and cobalt and various other things, that's something that we want to avoid. But there is local manufacturing going on there, so we want to champion that and make sure that we are keeping track of that carbon footprint, making sure that we aren't decarbonising in name only by offshoring all of those problems to someone else. It's not something we're interested in doing. It's all about making sure that we're taking this local perspective in every way possible. And then finally on EVs, there is a whole strategy for infrastructure for zero emission vehicles, which is part of the local transport plan developed in partnership with Transport for West Midlands. And they have an EV strategy and an infrastructure for EVs strategy. Looking at a whole range of charging solutions. So that's not necessarily home charging, it can be destination charging. They've identified a whole range of different options for that sort of thing. There have been studies on hydrogen cars within the region. Similarly, there are very significant constraints on the amount of hydrogen that we can generate. It's important to recognise that hydrogen is just an energy vector. It's a way of storing energy. It's not something that we come across as a natural resource in the same way that natural gas is extracted. And so the use of that is as a limited resource, a scarce resource, is generally going to be needed in more energy intense places. So for industries, for very large, heavy vehicles, the application for personal mobility is going to be quite limited. And so EVs are likely to be the main solution for that, but there are a whole range of charging solutions being pursued within the region.
Thank you.
I might add a couple of, I'm really fanatical about this stuff. In my small parish, we've got 6 planning applications for battery farms, 3 of which I actually support. I support them because you won't know they're there because they're going to be woods. Yeah, they're reasonably big. Basically, they're containers like you get on the backs of the lorries. They just fill them full of lithium-ion batteries, this fire suppressant systems in them, and you can hide them. If you don't hide them, as far as my view is, they shouldn't be allowed. What I didn't see in the proposals was the use of brownfield land within the West Midlands. You can stick these things on the most contaminated land, and it would certainly be better than sticking them on the fields in Berkswell. So I would like to see, I think I have support on this concept. But if we're going to do that, they have got to add to the environment and they need to be screened. And there's no reason why you can't put trees in urban environments. Oh, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? To hide these things as well as, and we need a positive strategy to make that happen. And I think on an allied kind of point, the one thing that the West Midlands has got that nowhere else in the country has got is large amounts of car park, huge amounts of car park. And the West Midlands ran a trial at the NEC of putting solar panels above car parking spaces. And I think we ought to be, within our strategy, have that level of detail. Because the really good thing about it is, in the summer, when I go shopping, my car is too blooming hot to put the ice cream in. If you stick it under some shade, called a solar panel, it won't be quite as bad. So this has got some benefits as well. And I think these kind of very practical solutions need to be within our strategy. I think they probably fit within either smart spatial planning, or they could be in co-located clean generation. I'm not exactly, maybe both. But I think that was kind of the practical stuff that Councillor Fenton was kind of getting into. And by the way, Councillor Fenton, if you're interested on how you measure combined heat, district heating systems, the Danes have been doing this for years. My wife happens to be Danish. And when I met her, she was in a brand new flat and they had little bulbs on the side of each radiator where the contents evaporated over the course of the year. And depending on how much you evaporated, that's how much you got charged. I'm sure there's probably electronic versions of doing this now, but this stuff has been around for ages and they really do work very well. And it can be, even if you're using gas, it can be a very effective method of ensuring people get efficient gas central heating. But you can do it with electricity nowadays, which would be, of course, a more environmentally friendly way of doing it, because that does work. Anyway, I think Councillor McKay was next.
Yeah, I mean, I'm originally come from the northeast of England, and Byker Wall, as it's called there, that's had a communal heating system since the 1970s. There's two questions I was going to ask. One was just a retrofit, which, is fundamental to quite a lot of the council stock, I think, that we've all got, across our areas. Certainly, I know in Birmingham, I'm not sure about the other regions, unfortunately, council stock built after the 1990s, I can imagine that can be retrofitted pretty well. The building practices haven't changed that much since then. Some of the earlier council stock, and when building practices were not particularly optimal for good outcomes, I think is the nicest way I could put that. I mean, how realistic is it that really old council stock is going to be able to retrofit it to give the outcomes that we want, rather than just throwing a load of money at it and getting a solution that so it doesn't really please anyone? And the other one I was just going to say on hydrogen, because I understood with that, they were running into some difficulties that I think, as you sort of alluded to, that hydrogen can't deliver the same power as gas and some of those things. So yeah, you've got a massive unit, you can put a big engine in it, but hydrogen, they just can't get the power out of it for a domestic car, and it's hit a bit of a dead end. Is that kind of where that is with that, or is there more to come on hydrogen? Thanks.
Yes, on retrofit, actually, you find that some of the more recent council housing does meet better energy performance standards as you would expect, and so it tends to be the slightly older buildings that are more in need of retrofit. We try to take we have technical advice within our team that are able to take a bespoke approach to homes, and so it's not just a case of slap up some external wall insulation identically on every home in the street. The whole retrofit approach is designed to be one that is tailored to individual buildings regardless of their characteristics. And yes, that is intensive work, it's difficult work, but it's something that gets easier with practice and experience, and so that's something that we have made sure to develop in-house, so we have that technical expertise growing all the time. On hydrogen, yes, I mean, there are some vehicles that burn hydrogen in the same way that there are LNG cars powered in very similar ways, but there are also hydrogen electrolyzer cars that are powered in a slightly different way. And yes, generally those aren't going to be suitable for small vehicles, as I say, but for larger vehicles, hydrogen as an energy vector, as a way of delivering power, may be more suitable, particularly when you get to a certain size of vehicle. Just the weight of a battery starts to become a limiting factor. So you're having to haul that around everywhere. Carrying around gas starts to become much more feasible there. Even then, there are a range of options. So yes, that's really one of the most fundamental challenges with those vehicles.
Thanks.
I'd like to pick up from that first point about the difficulties of people knowing how to insulate their homes. I mean, I've done it on mine because I actually know this was one of the things that the company I used to work for used to do. For most people, this industry is full of sharks. We've still got people flogging stuff to spray on the insides of the tiles of the roofs, which actually makes the properties unmortgageable. When are we going to get an approved supplier list, both for this is how you do it, and B, these are people who are warranted by us, we can recommend that we can direct owner occupiers who've got money to. We need that because the state is not going to retrofit 30 million houses. There's no chance in hell. We have got to get individuals to do this. And not everybody has got my level of knowledge. And even I suspect I got bits wrong. I just don't know what I got wrong. Is that part of our project to come up with that listing, both of people who are on an individual house saying, this is what you must do, and ideally that advice would be free. And then there's a list of suppliers you can go to who will do that work. Is that part of our plan? I think Councillor McKay, that was kind of what you were interested in. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I used to probably know. I remember, come from the construction industry. I was lucky enough to be involved when we supplied into Birmingham City Council in the 90s when they put all the new stuff in. So I know quite a lot, and I saw the quality of some of the older houses that were being taken out, and they'd take us in. Sometimes you go with a site manager in taking it down and they're spending time looking for the foundations. The way that some of those houses were built were really poor. And that money was built in the 90s. Those houses pretty much were constructed in the 90s through a tax break, because there was recession at the time. And when the economy picked up, the tax break was withdrawn. So there's a lot of older houses, council housing stock in Birmingham, I'm sure, across the region never got replaced. And so those houses still have those building practices in them. I personally would feel that for something that old, that property really those properties need to be taken down and replaced with something, probably a timber frame or something like that, and you get it from there. But ultimately, that is what you're right about. Those people that are spraying roofs, as creating insulation inside the roof. It's just a fantastic way of destroying your roofs. Really, it's not going to get anywhere. And I think there's an awful lot of people want to know how to retrofit the houses and be greener and save themselves some money, but there is no real way of people accessing sort of that, and even with solar panels, there's a lot to it, more than just getting someone to come out and put a solar panel on your roof. There's locations, etc., and the type that you put on, and it's still a complete minefield. And yeah, I think you're right. There's people sometimes just making money off the back of it without delivering the outcomes that people want, I would say.
So are the combined authority going to be able to help?
Yeah. Yes. So where buildings may be better off being torn down and replaced, that's an example where we need to be well aware of. We need to be plugging into spatial planning processes, so we aren't retrofitting properties that are only going to be there for a few more years. That would not be a very sensible use of public funds. On the able to pay market, yes, that advice role, that impartial advice role that has been identified as absolutely critical for enabling that wider market growth. That's something that is being pursued as part of the devolution deal funding. There are also community approaches that we are supportive of being pursued across the region, including Brum Energy, which is the largest one. So that's funded through the government's local energy advice demonstrator fund. So that's taking community groups who already have some connection to energy, where they already have a connection to their communities as well, and looking at innovative ways of delivering that advice. So it's not technical, it's ways that speak to communities in the way that they recognise it. So yes, these are all certainly things we are looking at.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. Is the combined authority going to be able to do anything? We've got about people's ability to invest in this area. We've got lots of people who've got cash. I personally I have got money which I invest. I cannot invest it in renewable energy, battery storage, because I don't know how to do it. My brother-in-law, who's Danish, has got money in Spanish wind farms, Italian solar farms, Danish windmills, because it's easy to do. It is very, very hard to do, and there is pension money that is available. Are you going to be able to work with other people to find a mechanism whereby people who have got money can actually invest in this sector? Because if the state can't afford to do it, you need to get people. But again, it needs to be an approved list, a way of getting into.
Yeah, so this is exactly what the local Net Zero Accelerator regional fund is being set up to do. How we can aggregate all of these separate funds, including individuals, pension funds, things like that. How do we pile those all into one thing so that we are able to then invest in place-based approaches? Actually, one of the most difficult things here is these approaches work best when you invest in them as a whole. When you look at the whole system approach, often investors will be interested in one particular aspect, but don't want to be involved in the wider system enabling functions, which we know are the bits that really make it work and thrive. And so one of the key challenges at the moment is working out how do you package that in such a way that it is investable as a whole package. And so yeah, we have colleagues working on that at the moment. Certainly one of the things that fits into the fifth pillar. It's all about making this investable, leveraging private finance, because as I'm sure everyone's aware, the public money is never going to be anywhere near enough to deliver this transition.
Thank you for that. And one final thing, at some point in time, will you be able to get somebody to brief this committee on how you're going to crack that skills and experience issue that you mentioned earlier? Because I think answering the question now is far too long. We have somebody working on that, do we?
Yes, so we have dedicated colleagues from the stream team working with us on that section of the strategy to make sure that we have a longer term plan, how that also relates to public funding, how we make the most of the devolution deal, but then how we work with the sector more widely. Yeah, we've had some initial discussions on that, and there's interest at the moment within both our team and the skills team on how we flesh that out as a proper strategy for skills in the green sector.
So roughly when would you be able to come to the committee with some thoughts on that?
Well, we will have the timeline for this strategy, which will be a more high level view, will be aiming for the November Combined Authority Board. Following that, we'll then be looking at where we can do some more detailed areas of research. I think skills is going to be one particular one, renewables will be another. I can get back to you, but I think another 6 months would probably be a good amount of time to really understand that. There are other areas of work. So there's the state of the region skills, green skills work that the Midlands, East and West Midlands, they're also working on this area. So it'd be good to make sure that we aren't jumping the gun on their work on this, because they have some good resource behind them on their ability to get some quantitative data.
So that sounds like next year's work plan, doesn't it? But if we could just take a note, because I know Councillor Kettle tends to be very interested in training and experience of these skills as well. So, so if you could just tell whomever you need to tell that we will be interested when they get close to having a plan. Thank you. Now, I think what we've got is 4 things that come out of this. There's lessons learned from the retrofit trials. We want a briefing on that. think people would like some detail put into the plan on the use of brownfield sites, the use of car parks for solar generation, and charging solutions for terraced housing somehow in the plan. I think that's what Councillor Fenton was terraced housing, was it? Yeah. So if those could go in the plan, that would be helpful. And we'd like some timescale put on when the advice service on what do you do, how do I sort my house out? If you could come back to us on when you think that piece of work will be ready and when an approved supplier list will be available as well. Have I missed anything or have I got the points that councillors wanted? Thank you. Well, thank you. I found that very interesting. I think other councillors did, so thank you for that. So if we could rapidly move on to the grant register, there's been one small change on the presentation of the register, which is the new grants are in yellow. So we've got the complete register, but it's only the ones on yellow that have been added. Has anybody any questions on the, well, you can ask questions on all of it, but on the yellow pieces in particular? If somebody could just give me a little bit more detail on the rail pay-as-you-go pilot, that would be helpful. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is actually, it's very exciting as well. Genuinely, it is very exciting. So, as you kind of know from Swift Card, you can use your Swift Card across Metro and across bus at the moment. There has long been, because of the interaction with rail operators. So this is part of a pilot that we're working with DfT, which would look at effectively TfL style kind of system where you can use the same card across, or there is currently a pilot in place. You would have seen that kind of publicised in a part of the region, but it's looking at effectively testing that and what it would take to roll that out across not just the West Midlands actually, but it's looking at the technology availability to do that nationally as well. So really, it actually genuinely is very exciting.
Councillor Baton.
Just picking up on the investment zone grant, and it's not really a question about the grant funding itself, but will we have an update on investment zones as we go through this year, Chair? Because I'm aware that that haven't been the easiest to understand or the easiest to get off the ground across the region. So I just think it's worthwhile the committee having, an update on it at some point.
If we could program that in, because I noticed we've got, I don't know, it's 60 million, no, it's more than 66 million or something like that of money on these, which is a lot of cash. So yes, please, if we could put that in, that would be helpful.
Can do.
Councillor McKay.
Yeah, I might be asking for a bit too much what I'm about to ask for, but I noticed on the 5G Innovation Regions programming grant, and it makes reference to the vision for communities and what they want with 5G. I can tell you one thing they don't want is that certainly affects here in Birmingham a lot, is that we've got quite a lot of nice green space, and the 5G operators can just drop their masts on there free of charge. And I know the communities don't want to look at their nice green space and see a 20-foot mast, and it's not so much the mast, it's all the boxes that go with it right across their middle of their green space. Quite often when just next to it there's a commercial site where they could put it, there's quite strict rules about what they can get charged these days. It's not the old days when people could hold them to ransom. There is rules about what they get charged, and it's only a few thousand a year now. It's not the tens that it used to be. And I would like it if we could give some sort of direction to the people like that, because otherwise, because it's a national infrastructure project, they can only ask, to me, it's not like a normal planning process. They go through it, but ultimately at the end of the day, the communities aren't really in favour of this. I mean, they want the speed and that, but they don't want the eyesore that comes with it. So thanks, Chair. So can we ask that they try not to destroy our neighbourhoods whilst they're doing it?
Is this you, Kate?
Obviously, I have to say, Linda obviously is straight in. She's
Oh,
So let me take that as away as an action. We'll come back and update you either by email with Lindsay or at the next committee as to whether or not we have got actually power to influence that or not, and if we have, how do we go about doing that? So we'll do an update either by email in the interim or back to next committee.
thank you. That's okay, yes. Councillor Penton, did you have a point?
Chair, I wanted to add on to that actually, please, Linda, if we can, because I think the bigger problem we have, particularly around where I live, is you get 4 or 5 masts from different companies all crop up in exactly the same space. And I wondered whether we could look to see if the combined authority had any powers to get them to share and be a bit more communal, so that we could just have maybe 2 masts instead of 5. Particular piece of land, and I'm being a bit naughty here, Chair, because it's in my constituency, actually currently has 4 masts already on it with 2 more masts planned. And it's a lot. So is there any way we could look at distributing them more evenly or getting people to share?
That's great. I will take that away, and we'll make sure we do a briefing as to what we can, where the boundaries of our influence are, and how we can operate within that as well. I'll come back to a note on that.
Thank you. We're almost at noon now. I think I'd like to move on to the last item, which is work programme. Is there anything additional, apart from everything that we've added in this meeting, which has been several, that we wish to add to the work programme? Is the work programme in the right order? If not, I will move on to just declaring when the next meeting is. So I think everybody's content. So our next meeting is on the 21st of October. However, within the pack was a long list of other meetings, and I would ask people to check that those are in your diaries or passed on to the people who will replace you at the next meeting if you have to come from Coventry. But can we circulate those again electronically? Because I think that was really useful, just having those. And it's all right me asking somebody from Coventry to pass it on to them. It's probably not the best process.
Yes, Chair. Yes, Chair. Happy to do that. So an updated version of the work programme was shared in front of you today. The updated copy now includes the finance training sessions that have been scheduled, and also the workshop sessions to help prepare you for your forthcoming mayoral Q&As with the mayor. So those are all scheduled in diaries now. But yes, happy to circulate the updated version electronically so everybody's got it.
Is that this, Linda?
Yeah,
That is
it is.
We've actually got no lights when we're doing all these on.
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, on that point, I think I'll declare the meeting closed. I'll see everybody in October. Actually, we've got a training session before then, but I will definitely see everybody in October. Thank you very much.
Thank you.